there was an immense amount of skepticism, right, around these wounds to play, quote, devil's advocate and to show the church doesn't just accept these manifestations at face value. There was doubt around it, right?
There was a tremendous amount of doubt. There was great opposition. Because what happens in extraordinary souls like Padre Pio that are given great grace, and the grace was given not for the sake of Padre Pio, but for its evangelical impact, for the sake of evangelization. Now, Our Lady, Mary, Mother, appeared at Fatima in 1917, and she promised an extraordinary amount of grace. And she warned of an upcoming war. The Second World War was more than 20 years ago, so it wasn't on anybody's mind. And the Great War, the First World War, was at its tail end. But yet she's prophesying this great war that's coming. But she's prophesying that she's got her help. And I am personally believing that Padre Pio, such a devotee of his, was the help that she sent. Because Padre Pio was the face of hope during the Second World War. He was what strengthened so many people, not just in Europe, but worldwide. And he became, in one sense, the face of the Christian faith worldwide. And all of the stories of the mystical phenomena gave people that, that there's this living saint that's out there. God's alive. So in the midst of this horror, in the midst of the bombings, in the midst of the infiltrations, in the midst of the insurrections, in the midst of the arrests, in the midst of the concentration camps, that God is alive and He's doing extraordinary things in the world. And that gave growth and probably kept it from going to the edge.
All right, Father, obviously Padre Pio has enormous significance when it comes to spiritual warfare. There's a lot of stories around it, but could you help us understand, he wasn't a deputized exorcist, right? He was a priest whom you might say the enemy took particular interest in?
That's correct. He was not a deputed exorcist, so he wasn't an exorcist in the modern sense of the word, and what you would I define an exorcist to be. But he was an exorcist in the sense that he drove out demons, not through use of the ritual, but just through sheer holiness. And he did that first and foremost by forming people, by making them turn from their sin. And that caused them to shake their demons, because guess what? The pacts that they made, the covenants they made, the agreements that they made, the bonds they forged, they're gone. They're dissolved through the grace of the sacrament. The demons now have to leave. There's nothing left for them to hold on to. But also, in an extraordinary way, there would be moments where people would fall down and start manifesting in front of Padre Pio. In other words, when they were standing in front of him or within eye shot, the demons were struck with a terror because there was something holy within Padre Pio, and so they became a manifestation. And so Padre Pio might come and walk in front of that person and trace the sign of the cross, and he would be delivered. And I say might because sometimes he didn't have to do that. Just pray from a distance, and for all intents and purposes, it looked like, holy cow, like, Mrs. Shephouse just fell on her back and started writhing. She clearly has a demon. Padre Pio turned his head towards her and looked at her for maybe half a second and then just walked away as if nothing was happening. But why did he ignore her? And then all of a sudden she gets up and she's fine. In other words, he didn't have to do anything. That the conversation, the dialogue between he and God and he and the devil was of such an astounding nature that was enough to liberate Mrs. Shephouse.
There are, Father, stories that he would battle demons routinely and was attacked himself. There's an anecdote about him being attacked every night in his parents' home. Are you familiar with that story?
Oh yeah, very familiar. Yeah. So, Padre Pio, he entered the Capuchins in 1903. So at that time, I think, he was 16 years old, quite a young man, and he began formation with them. And then 4 years later, in 1907, partly because of poor health, he was allowed to visit and stay with his parents for an extended period. Now, he wasn't kicked out of the order. They just sent him home. He was a model Capuchin. They sent him home for a period of rest to gain his strength back before he went back to the monastery. And this is not an unheard of thing, because there are lives were very austere. They lived an austere life. And so, before making final vows, he was allowed to go home. And he would be ordained a priest 3 years later, in 1910. But he was already a friar living the life of a monk. That's the thing. So at his parents' house, at 9:30 each night, he was diabolically attacked. So from his room, the family heard cries, screams, and the sound of solid bodies. They would describe hitting the floor as if people were being thrown down onto the floor. And the poundings would cause the entire house to shake. And the first time that this happened, of course, it's obviously startled everyone. And so his family all stormed his room, and what they saw was his furniture strewn about. So his bed was scattered throughout the room. The blankets on top were scattered. The chairs were all upside down. The books were strewn about. The inkwells was tipped over and on the floor, but the ink was strewn all about the walls. And so in the middle of the room, there's Brother Pio just standing still and silent. Right? In the midst of these episodes where the poundings and this diabolical phenomenon was happening, he's standing still. Now, as soon as they open the door and look at it, like, all the movement instantly stopped. So they didn't see the movement, but they saw the effects of it. And so when he became aware that they had come into his room, he chased them out, he scurried them out, shut the door, and then he slid the bolt. And every night this happened. And he wouldn't talk about it. They would ask him questions. He would say nothing about it. One day, in fact, so it was already past 9 p.m. and Brother Pio wasn't home. He was visiting the parish priest at the church up the street. And so his father entered his room, and just seeing the ink-stained walls, he said, he was struck with a fright, and he ran towards the front door. In other words, like, I gotta get out of this house. He was just hit with the creeps, and he just had to get out. But he stopped himself right at the door, and he said, gosh, if I run outside like this, like a terrified child, and the neighbors are gonna see me, and I'm gonna be embarrassed. So he stopped right at the door, and his thought is, you know what, I'm going to wait for my son to come back from visiting the priest. I'm just going to wait right here by the door. And then when he caught sight of his son returning from the church, his father heard a voice from behind him, from inside the house, saying, here comes the Holy One.
Entering California.
And so when Brother Pio entered the house, the same voice spoke again and said the same thing. Here comes the Holy One. And Brother Pio just answered, yep, I'm back home. And that was the end of that night's encounter. But, I mean, he went into his room, slid the bolt, and the diabolical junk happened again. But the thing to note about this is, in the saints that wrestled in an extraordinary way with the devil, so Brother Pio certainly did, St. John Vianney certainly did, Catherine of Siena certainly did. All of these encounters happened when these folks were young. When they became old men and women, the attack stopped. And the devil didn't hound them. Why? Because by then they were already saints. They were established saints, and in fact it wounded the devil when he came around. It was actually frustrating. Because when he would launch a diabolical attack, all he was met with was profound holiness. So in fact, it was counterproductive. The more he attacked them, the more real estate of his kingdom he lost. So he just stopped coming around.
Wow. All right. Demonic torment. It's a young man's game. So, Father, as an exorcist yourself, how do you interpret these assaults on him? And correct me if I'm wrong, but these seem to be, why at first, but God is allowing these saints to be persecuted in such a way. Is this for refinement? Is this just happening in a broken world and the demons say, oh my gosh, look at this future priest with this enormous amount of potential and gift, and they're trying to dislodge them from the trajectory they're on? Now, how do you interpret attacks like this?
Yeah, so it's God inviting the individual in question Christ Suffering Company. Christ, of course, doesn't suffer any longer. He did at his incarnation, but all of that ended at his resurrection. Christ, it's impossible for him to suffer any longer. Nevertheless, within his mystical body, within the membership of his saints that form that body which he is building, in them he does suffer. And in fact, St. Paul tells us we make up in our bodies what is lacking in the suffering of Christ. So this is a scandalous thing that Paul said. It sounds scandalous. What do you mean we make up for what's lacking in the suffering of Christ? Are you telling me that Christ didn't do it all? Are you telling me that there's something lacking in it? Yes, I am, is what Paul is telling us. That there is a suffering he has laid out and apportioned for you and for me. And we make up for it. We make that contribution as members of Christ's mystical whole. And so for those who make up for it in a big way, Christ has apportioned for them, like he did with Padre Pio, something astounding. And, you know, there's lots of it that we aren't privy to. Padre Pio and the stigmatists in history, they're embarrassed by it. Padre Pio didn't want to be known for it. He covered up his wounds. He wore gloves. He didn't draw any attention to it. He didn't go on Oprah and hold up his hands, hey, look at my hands, and then try to defend himself. Look, I'm being so honest. I'm not proving that. Here's a doctor who ran tests on me. Here's another doctor. Now, he did have doctors that ran tests on him. It was never his decision. It was never at his doing. He didn't try to shore up his case and to build backers and build fans through an uncompromising integrity. They were imposed on his tests by the Vatican. And he cooperated with him in every step of the way. And even there was at one point where supervising alcohol and tested that for 20 days he ate nothing. That there was no other food that entered his mouth. 20 days straight, save foods that he consumed in impossible for him to eat. And so this kind of mystical thing, these amazing, extraordinary feats were done at God's behest within Padre Pio. And they drew attention to his character because God had him a special mission. A convincing demeanor and disposition that God wanted to have, that all of these signs to have, because Padre Pio had an extraordinary mission of evangelism, not just tens of people, but tens of thousands.
For our listeners out there who are new to this or just hear this and go, this sounds like a really cool God. You know, his son is martyred and crucified, and that his saints are sent demons to torment them. There's manifestations of open wounds on them. Could you maybe walk us through a little bit about God's character and how it's compatible with his goodness, these sort of, you know, extra sufferings even. Obviously we all suffer as humans on this planet and in this life, but when you look at some of these extraordinary manifestations that happened to Padre Pio, who was doing all this incredible work, how would you maybe explain to someone how this is in line with God's good character?
Well, goodness, I wouldn't think that would be challenging. God's Son became incarnate to free us from sinfulness, from the pains of death, from sin, sickness, and death. And he encountered an extraordinarily difficult life. He experienced suffering, even unto death. And if God does that to his Son, it should not shock us that he calls all of us to suffer to some extent. But that especially he calls some extraordinarily graced souls that he has apportioned out for a particular friendship, a special friendship, and that he's equipping them to handle something extraordinary in terms of suffering for the sake of the salvation of God. This is exactly.
And Father, too, I mean, it's a little different, right? But also Christ was sent out into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan for 40 days, and at the end it necessitated angels coming to minister to him. So is that fair to say that's also comparable?
It certainly is. And look, why did the Father send angels for his Son to minister? It's because his Son was so wounded by his encounter with the devil that he hit the wall. He was non-functional, and so he needed help. He needed the ministry of angels because it took so much of what he had inside him that he had nothing left. He was unable to take care of this. Now, this shouldn't scandalize us, but it shows us two things. The depth of the strength of the enemy, but the profound depth and strength of the Son, and the extent of which he suffered to exert them in order to triumph on our behalf. He didn't need to defeat the devil so he could snap his fingers and the devil's done. It's done. But he came and he undertook a visible struggle with the enemy in order to not just defeat the enemy, but allow us to have a visual of the depth of his love.
We can leave suffering for here in a minute, but I guess to distill it down, Father, too, for obviously this has plagued many scholars and philosophers over the centuries and thousands of years, but if you distill down just God's allowing us to go through and suffer these great things, is the main reason to divorce us from confidence in this life and this iteration, or one of the main purposes, I should say, that when we suffer, we are reminded that this is not the final destination?
Yeah, absolutely. And if God didn't send us suffering, we'd fall into that religion. So out of his goodness, he's got to give us suffering so that we don't fall into that trap.
All right. Well, that's probably why when you consume too much of the wrong foods, there are gastrointestinal consequences, lest we eat it all the time, right, Father? All right. Well, let's lighten it up a little bit and go to a superpower that I think some of us wish we had, but we might be actually misunderstanding what it is. But Father, Padre Pio is the only saint I've heard of. Maybe there's others you could educate us on that allegedly have this power. But did you walk us through the stories of bilocation and just what is bilocation, and why would you be on the side of believing it actually did happen, Padre Pio?
Yeah, so bilocation is, gosh, certainly an extraordinary gift, a very rare gift. And what it means is that the individual is at 18 different physical localities at the same. Now, we're in the realm of mysticism. So what that means is we're not in the realm where things make sense in the ordinary laws of nature, understanding of what enters into common sense. But there are numerous accounts of Padre Pio being at his monastery, which is especially during his periods of house arrest, he was there. And we'll get into that in a second. Why in heaven's name was he under house arrest? But even in times when he wasn't under house arrest, so he's a friar living in a monastery. For him to leave the monastery, to leave the grounds of the monastery, would require permission from his superiors. And yet, there are accounts of him being seen at times hundreds of miles away. There's one account of a German pilot who had orders to drop bombs over a village. And all of a sudden, he sees out in the sky a Franciscan monk with a terrifying face at him saying, "Don't you dare do that." So he turns the plane around. And so there's a repugnance of heart that he feels like, gosh, it was an immoral action that I was asked to do, and I'm glad I can do it. And he goes on a pilgrimage to seek out a priest at San Giovanni Rotondo, the town where Padre Pio lives. And he actually sees that friar in Padre Pio that was in the sky. And he goes up to him and he said, "It is so good for your eternal soul that you did today. And I don't think I didn't drop the ball." And he just walks away. So there's no way Padre Pio was up in the sky. And yet this is account of his surgery. There are other examples. So there's a Monsignor who was at his sister's home. She's in a coma and was dying. There was another priest who was there anointing her. So the Monsignor is sitting in his living room and he's waiting for the priest inside to finish. his father was immensely ashamed of it, and every day would tell his wife, don't let him go outside. And every day she would defy him that, maybe this is the day that God is going to see him. Because he was ashamed because his son would crawl and roll about throughout town, and he would be the object of ridicule. The kids would throw rocks at him and so on. So one day he's crawling about throughout town, and he feels this hand on him, and the hand pulls him up, and he turns around and he looks at the hand, and it's a bloody hand, and it's connected to a friar, a Capuchin friar, and it's Padre Pio. And so the kid is healed. He's standing up straight. So much so that the kid, Giovanino, goes home and starts pounding on the door of his house, and his mother answers the door and says, what is it? Can I help you? In other words, she didn't recognize her own son. And he says, Mom, it's me. It's Giovanino. Padre Pio healed me. And so they had the kid examined by doctors. Now, internally, his organs were still the way they were. His lungs and the other internal organs were still kind of in a curved and slightly compressed state. But his spine was perfectly straight, like a normal spine. And so he lived a normal life after that. And so, Padre Pio was not in Foggia. In other words, that is impossible to have occurred in the universe with the physical laws that it has, by which it is bound. It is impossible for Padre Pio to have left the monastery and to be present there, and then to return to the monastery in another instant. So we have to go to another explanation. And what many people have offered is the gift of bilocation, the grace, the mystical grace of bilocation, whereby God enables certain people to be in simultaneous places at one time.
Father, do you wish you had this gift?
I wish for only the gifts that God wants me to have and no others. I want nothing more, but I also want nothing less than what He wants me to have, because I know that what He has made the decision to be incarnate within me is what is most useful for my salvation and for the salvation of those people in whom He wants me to have an impact.
All right, that's the right answer. Good job. All right, Father, as we wrap up Miracle Hour, what do you think is the strongest evidence that a lot of this stuff actually happened? Obviously, a lot of myth can surround someone of this popularity, but what do you think is the strongest evidence that a lot of what we're talking about actually happened?
Oh gosh, just the sheer number of claimants. Think about it. Think about it. Let's take a look at this in a sober, rational way. Okay? How many detractors do you think a man like Padre Pio had? How many people do you think might be able to think, this is just so unbelievable. I'm going to go and I'm going to find the evidence that all of this is bogus. How many people do you think may have been like that in history? And think about it. If that existed, it would have been found. But it hasn't been found. I'm thinking of two modern occasions, and look, I don't mean to get political here, but these are the examples that came to mind. Look at the claim during his first term that President Trump had engaged in collusion with Russia. Look how much money was spent in that investigation. So all they had to do was present evidence of it. There was a great many smart people looking for that. But guess what? There was never any evidence of any collusion. At the same time, look how many people were trying to establish a proof that President Obama was not born in the United States. And they claimed this and that and this. But at the end of the day, there was just no solid proof offered. Because if there was solid proof, then that would prevent the man from being president. And every single action that he did as president would be invalid. So look, both of these things, they just didn't exist. And you had an extraordinary manhunt in each case of looking for evidence that was never found. And the same thing with Padre Pio. Like, you could make one heck of a career if you were the guy that cracked the code, and you were able to prove that all of this stuff was bogus, that this was a big charade, that the wool was being pulled over your eyes, my eyes, everybody's eyes. You could have made a great career out of that, right? You would have gotten tremendous notoriety. But all of those people, all of those efforts, including the Vatican, because Padre Pio had his detractors inside the church who thought he was a great big. So the Vatican itself suspended his ministry and said, you're still a priest, and you can still celebrate Mass, but you're going to do so privately, alone, apart from anyone at the monastery, and you're not going to present yourself publicly to anyone. That went on for years, and Padre Pio obeyed. It hurt him, wounded him, but that's what he did. And people asked him years later, like one Vatican investigator asked us what he did. He says, well, I pray, I read, and I play tricks on my brothers here in the house. He was a great fan of practical jokes. And so even in the midst of this great sad period, he kept up his sense of humor. And so we have somebody here who is very real. And I think the sheer testimony of that, the fact that there are living people, again, this didn't happen 8 centuries ago. This happened a mere decades ago. And living people today lived through a great many of Padre Pio events. They were eyewitnesses, and they were beneficiaries, and they offer their testimony. And the fact that tens and tens of thousands of people are all wrong, or all colluding to lie, that just doesn't make any sense. But we know, in God's realm, He does call saints, and He calls them and endows some of them with extraordinary mystical gifts, and that's what we do. And so it was a great gift for us to have a saint like this, and He has given people, and it's just a sign that God is taking care of us, that God is hearing us. You know, I'll tell you this, I have a relic of Padre Pio, and I had it at my desk at one time. It was mounted in the reliquary. I was doing a project, and I remember at this time I was living in Toronto, Canada. I was chaplain at York University, in addition to doing my relic ministry. And there was a petition that I had at the time. It was something for which I was praying. The relic that was on my desk next to me, in that moment, caught my eye. I'd been doing something else. I was writing something. And I just gave that petition to Padre Pio, and I said, look, please pray for this. And I touched it with my thumb. I touched the window of the relic with my thumb. And I tell you, it felt like I had just put my thumb on the flame of a blowtorch. So it didn't hurt me in the sense that it didn't burn my finger, but there was an intensity that was even painful. Like it woke me up. And it was a sign of, hey, I'm here, I hear you, I got this. That's what it told to me. And it fits so well with how Padre Pio lived. You know, like the guy, he was a guy's guy. Loved a good cigar, was not one of these saints that you see on the holy card, wears blush and almost looks like maybe he has lipstick, like a holy card saint. You know, there was an account, this lady ran up to him one time and ripped some hairs out of his chin to have a relic because she's in front of the famous Padre Pio. Well, he just wound up and he clocked her, smacked her across the face and sent her backwards. And then he just kept walking. Like, you just pulled hair out of my face and you need a smack. And that's exactly what he gave her. It's exactly what she got. There's another account where his job was to teach, was to catechize some second graders and prepare them for reception of First Communion. So this is taking place inside the church. So their teacher brings the class into the church, sits them in the pews. And she goes up to Padre Pio and said, be careful with that guy, because he's a troublemaker. And so Padre Pio just walked up to him and said, if you make any trouble at all, I'm going to take your head and I'll smash it against the altar. And the kid was the epitome of well-being. Right, so he was a guy's guy, just a human being who intensely loved God and lived life intensely, but who could laugh and enjoyed a good time, enjoyed happiness, mirth, and just lightheartedness.
Father, since you are the relic master, and we have mentioned a couple times relics of Padre Pio, have you been in an exorcism where a demon has recognized or given any indication that Padre Pio might be there working on behalf of the victim, in the same way Monsignor Giamataro mentioned that he had seen demons claim that St. Joseph was present?
I sure have. I've seen them show intense aversion and detestation to a relic of Padre Pio when applied. I've never seen one named Padre Pio, but for that matter, I've never seen a demon name a particular saint by name. Anyway, they don't like to do that. They don't like to name names because somebody's name, like your name, was the name given at your baptism in the Christian cosmology. And so that's an acknowledgement of the act by which he was defeated. To name somebody by their first name, the name they received at baptism by a demon, is to already kind of point to the act that defeated him. So demons don't do that. But I've seen them tremendously writhe and show great aversion, show detestation, show great pain, show great animosity towards a relic of Padre Pio when it is applied to them.
Okay. Well, Father, I thought it might be fitting if we could close with a quote from Padre Pio, one of my personal favorites. He says, "In the spiritual life, he who does not advance goes backwards. It happens as with a boat which must always go ahead. If it stands still, the wind will blow it back." Amen?
Amen.
All right. Well, folks, thank you so much for listening. This has been the Padre Pio History Hour with Father Carlos Martins. We look forward to bringing you our next and maybe our last bonus episode. We do have more case files coming on the way, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for listening, folks. Father, thanks so much for this incredible conversation.
Okay, my pleasure. God bless you all.